Good evening all, and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I bring you a descent into the darkest corners of Appalachia, where the mountains do not just hide secrets, they devour them. In this episode, we will explore 8 of the most disturbing true crime stories ever to emerge from these ancient hills. From vanishings that defy explanation to encounters with evil that wore a human face, these are the accounts that local law enforcement could not solve and that time has failed to erase. Each story you are about to hear has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from documented cases, survivor testimonies, and investigations that remain open to this day. While names and certain identifying details have been changed to protect those involved, the core of each account remains intact, preserved exactly as it was reported by those who lived through these nightmares. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are real events that happened to real people in places you could drive through tomorrow. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Paranoia Files for daily true horror content that will chill you to your core. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode when darkness comes calling. Now let us begin our journey into the heart of Appalachia, where 8 stories wait to be told, and where the truth is far more terrifying than any fiction could ever be. Every time I drive past that hiking trail marker, my stomach drops. It has been 12 years, but I still see his face. I still hear his voice from that morning joking about how we were going to conquer the ridge before sunset. I still feel the weight of knowing that I was the last person to see Canyon alive, and that I will never understand what happened to him in those woods. It was the summer of 2013, and I was 26 years old, working a soul-crushing office job in Richmond, Virginia. My college friends and I had maintained a tradition since graduation of taking one big camping trip each year, just to remind ourselves that life existed outside of cubicles and spreadsheets. That year, we decided on a 3-day backpacking trip through a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains near the Virginia-Kentucky border. The area was not heavily trafficked, which was exactly what we wanted. We craved isolation, silence, the kind of peace you can only find when civilization is miles away. There were 5 of us on that trip. Canyon was the one who organized everything. He was the experienced hiker in our group, the guy who actually knew the difference between a topo map and a trail map, who could tell you which water sources were safe and which would give you giardia. He had been hiking these mountains since he was a kid with his father. He knew what he was doing. That is what made everything that happened so impossible to accept. We started our hike on a Friday morning in late June. The weather was perfect, warm but not oppressive, with a breeze that kept the bugs at bay. The trail was well marked for the first several miles, winding through dense hardwood forest that smelled like earth and moss. Canyon led the way, and the rest of us followed, talking and laughing, taking photos of interesting rock formations and the occasional deer that would dart across our path. By the evening of the first day, we had covered about 8 miles and made camp near a small stream. We cooked freeze-dried meals over a portable stove, told stories around a modest campfire, and fell asleep to the sound of running water. It was exactly the kind of trip we had hoped for. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt off. The forest was just a forest, beautiful and indifferent. The second day started much the same way. We broke camp around 8 in the morning and continued along the trail. Canyon was in good spirits, maybe even better than usual. He kept pointing out different types of trees and plants, giving us unsolicited lessons on Appalachian ecology that we pretended to be more interested in than we actually were. Around midday, we reached a clearing that overlooked a small valley. The view was stunning, the kind of vista that makes you understand why people become obsessed with hiking. Canyon suggested that we take an extended break for lunch. We dropped our packs and sat on the rocky outcrop, eating sandwiches and trail mix, soaking in the sun. That was when Canyon mentioned something that I have replayed in my mind 1,000 times since that day. He said almost casually that something felt off about the area. I remember laughing it off, asking if he was trying to spook us with some Blair Witch nonsense. He smiled, but it did not quite reach his eyes. He said he could not explain it, just a feeling. A sense that we were being watched. None of us took him seriously. Canyon was not the type to believe in superstitions or ghost stories. If anything, he was aggressively rational. The kind of guy who would explain away every weird sound in the night with facts about nocturnal animals and wind patterns. So when he said something felt wrong, it struck me as out of character, but not alarming. Just Canyon being weird. We finished lunch and prepared to continue hiking. That was when Canyon made a suggestion. He said that according to his map, there was a good camping spot about 2 miles ahead near a natural spring. He wanted to scout ahead to make sure it was as good as the guidebook claimed. Said he would be back in 45 minutes, maybe an hour at most. The rest of us could take our time, enjoy the view a bit longer, and he would meet us back at the clearing. If the spot was good, we could push on and set up camp early. If not, we would revise our plans. It seemed like a reasonable idea. Canyon had his day pack with water and snacks. He had his GPS device, his phone, a whistle, all the safety gear you are supposed to carry. He was the most prepared person I have ever met. We watched him disappear into the tree line, following a side trail that branched off from the main path. That was at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon on June 15, 2013. 45 minutes passed, then an hour, then 90 minutes. We started to feel uneasy. Canyon was never late, never unreliable. At the 2-hour mark, we decided to follow the trail he had taken. We called his name as we walked, our voices echoing through the trees. The side trail was narrow, less maintained than the main path, overgrown in places. We hiked for about a mile, maybe a bit more, before we found something that made my blood run cold. Canyon's backpack was sitting on a flat rock, right in the middle of the trail. It was placed carefully, almost deliberately, as if someone had set it down gently. His water bottle was still in the side pocket, and when I touched it, it was still cold. That meant it had not been sitting there long. We opened the pack and found everything intact. His wallet, his phone, his GPS device, his first aid kit, even his snacks. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed. We called his name louder now, with more urgency. We searched the immediate area, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. That was when we found his boots. They were about 100 yards from the backpack, sitting side by side in the dirt just off the trail. The laces were still tied. It looked as if he had simply stepped out of them, as if they had been pulled off his feet while they were still laced up. But that should not have been possible unless someone had forcibly removed them. The ground around the boots was muddy from a stream that crossed the trail. We should have been able to see footprints, some indication of which direction Canyon had gone. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of struggle. It was as if he had simply stopped existing at that exact spot. We immediately tried calling for help, but none of our phones had service. Canyon's phone, which we had retrieved from his backpack, was the same. No signal. We made the decision to split up. 2 of us would stay at the location with the boots and backpack in case Canyon returned, while the other 2 would hike back to the main trail and try to find a ranger station, or at least get to a point where we could call for help. It took nearly 3 hours for the 2 who left to reach a location with cell service. They called 911 and explained the situation. Park rangers arrived at the trailhead by early evening, and a search and rescue operation was launched that night. By the time the SAR team reached us, it was nearly dark. They set up a base camp and began a systematic search of the area using flashlights and thermal imaging equipment. The search continued for 5 days. They brought in tracking dogs, helicopters, dozens of volunteers from local hiking clubs. They searched in expanding grids covering miles of dense forest. They interviewed us repeatedly, asking us to recount every detail of the day, every conversation, every observation. They checked Canyon's phone records, his GPS data, his social media accounts, looking for any clue about his state of mind or his intentions. They found nothing that suggested he had planned to disappear. On the third day of the search, something happened that I cannot explain, and that the officials never adequately addressed. The search dogs, 3 different trained tracking dogs from 3 different handlers, all refused to go past a certain point. They were following a scent trail, the handlers said, and then all 3 dogs at almost the exact same location simply sat down and began to whine. The handlers said they had never seen anything like it. These were dogs trained to track people through miles of wilderness, through rivers, through all kinds of terrain. But they would not go past that invisible line in the forest. One handler tried to force his dog forward, and the animal became so distressed that it started to shake. The area where the dogs stopped was searched thoroughly by human teams. They found nothing, no trace of Canyon, no evidence of what might have spooked the dogs. Just trees and rocks and dirt. On the 4th day, they expanded the search to include the theory that Canyon might have suffered some kind of medical emergency, a stroke or a heart attack, and wandered off in a confused state. But that did not explain the boots. That did not explain the carefully placed backpack. That did not explain the complete absence of any physical evidence. By day 5, the official search was called off. The rangers told us that they had covered every realistic possibility, that if Canyon were alive and mobile in the search area, they would have found him. They said the case would remain open, that they would follow up on any new leads, but that there was nothing more they could do with the resources available. They suggested that Canyon might have left the area voluntarily, that perhaps he had been picked up by someone on a nearby road, though the nearest road was over 6 miles away through extremely difficult terrain. We did not believe that. Canyon had no reason to disappear. His life was stable. He had a good job, a girlfriend he was planning to propose to, a family who loved him. He was not the type to stage his own disappearance. And even if he had wanted to, why would he leave his wallet, his phone, his identification? Why would he leave his boots? The case was eventually classified as a missing person case with suspicious circumstances. Canyon's family held a memorial service 6 months later, though they never declared him legally dead. His girlfriend moved away. His parents still maintain a Facebook page dedicated to finding him, though the posts have become less frequent over the years. I have tried to move on. I have tried to tell myself that there must be a rational explanation, that someday someone will find evidence that explains what happened. But I cannot shake the feeling that something took Canyon from that trail. Something that does not follow the rules we understand. I have done research since then, more than I probably should have. I have learned that the Appalachian Mountains have an unusually high number of unexplained disappearances. People vanish without a trace, often in areas that are heavily searched. Experienced hikers, people who know the wilderness, who have all the right gear and training. They simply disappear. Some are never found. Others are found miles away from where they should have been, in areas that seem impossible to reach. Some are found deceased with no clear cause of death, their belongings arranged in strange ways. I do not know what happened to Canyon. I do not know if he is still out there somewhere, if his remains are hidden under leaves and rocks waiting to be discovered by some hiker decades from now. I do not know if something human took him or something else. I do not know if he suffered or if whatever happened was quick. What I do know is this. The rangers told us that people do not just vanish like that, but Canyon did. And sometimes, late at night when I cannot sleep, I wonder if he is still out there in those mountains, or if the mountains took him somewhere we cannot follow. Somewhere that exists in the spaces between the trees where the search dogs refuse to go and where footprints do not form in the mud. I have not been hiking since that trip. I cannot. Every time I see a forest, I think of Canyon walking into those trees, confident and capable and never walking out. I think of his boots sitting in the dirt, laces still tied. I think of his backpack carefully placed as if he were coming back for it, but he never did, and I do not think he ever will. I was 10 years old when Sedona moved into the house at the end of our holler in eastern Kentucky. She was 16, quiet, and had these hollow eyes that made you look away. Even as a child, I knew there was something wrong with her, something broken that went deeper than sadness. I did not have the words for it then, but I recognized the look of someone who had seen things that children should never see. It was the autumn of 1998, and our community was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors brought casseroles when someone got sick. We were isolated, tucked away in a valley where the mountains rose up on all sides like walls, where the nearest town with a grocery store was 40 minutes down a winding road that became impassable in winter. It was the kind of place where strangers stood out, where new arrivals were noticed and discussed over every dinner table within 24 hours. The traveling preacher and his family arrived on a Sunday morning in a caravan of 3 vehicles, dusty and road-worn, pulling into the parking lot of the old abandoned church on Cemetery Road. The building had been empty for 5 years, ever since Reverend Hoskins passed away and the congregation dissolved, its members absorbed into other churches in neighboring towns. No one had quite known what to do with the property, so it had simply sat there, windows intact but interior slowly surrendering to mold and mice. The preacher's name was Brother Samuel, though I never learned his last name. He was a tall, gaunt man with a voice that carried, the kind of voice that sounded like it was always delivering a sermon even when he was just saying hello. He had a wife, Sister Grace, who smiled too much and spoke too little, and they had Sedona, their only child, a teenage girl who moved like she was afraid of taking up too much space. Brother Samuel went door to door that first week, introducing himself, explaining that the Lord had called him to minister to our community, that he had purchased the old church property and intended to restore it to its proper purpose. He was charismatic in a way that made people uncomfortable but also compelled. My father said there was something off about the man, but my mother, who was more generous in her assessments, said we should give him a chance. After all, we could use a church closer to home. Within a month, Brother Samuel had gathered a small congregation. It started with 12 people, mostly older folks who remembered when the church had been active, who were drawn by nostalgia and the convenience of not having to drive so far for services. But the congregation grew. Brother Samuel had a way of preaching that was intense, passionate, full of fire and brimstone and promises of salvation for those who truly surrendered themselves to God's will. I started seeing Sedona at school. We rode the same bus, though she sat alone, at the front while I sat with my friends toward the back. She never spoke to anyone unless spoken to first, and even then her responses were whispers. She wore long-sleeved dresses even in warm weather, dresses that looked homemade and old-fashioned, and her hair was always pulled back in a tight braid that made her face look even more gaunt than it already was. I do not know why I decided to talk to her. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the kind of reckless compassion that children sometimes have before the world teaches them to mind their own business. One day on the bus ride home, I moved up to sit beside her. She flinched when I sat down, actually physically recoiled as if expecting to be hit. I remember that moment vividly because it was the first time I truly understood that not every home was like mine, that not every parent was safe. We became something like friends, though calling it friendship feels inaccurate. It was more like I talked and she listened, occasionally offering small pieces of herself in return. She never came to my house and I was never invited to hers. We existed in the neutral territory of school and the bus, and that seemed to be all she could manage. Over the weeks, I began to notice things. Sedona flinched at loud noises. She would not eat certain foods, pushing away anything that looked too rich or flavorful, as if she had been trained to accept only the most basic sustenance. And she had scars. I saw them one day when her sleeve rode up during gym class, thin white lines crisscrossing her forearms like a map of old pain. When she caught me looking, she quickly pulled her sleeve down and turned away. I asked her about the scars once, in what I thought was a gentle way. She looked at me with those hollow eyes and said very quietly that they were from purification. I did not understand what that meant, and when I pressed her to explain, she just shook her head and said that her father had to get the demons out, that it was necessary, that it was for her own good. I went home that day and told my mother what Sedona had said. I expected her to dismiss it as some strange religious practice that I was too young to understand, but instead her face went pale. She asked me to repeat exactly what Sedona had told me. Then she called my father into the kitchen and they spoke in low, urgent voices while I sat at the table, suddenly afraid that I had done something wrong by telling. My mother decided to invite Sedona and her family for dinner, though my father was against it. He said we should not get involved, that some families operated by different rules and it was not our place to interfere. But my mother insisted. She said that if something was wrong, if that girl was being hurt, then it was absolutely our place to do something about it. The dinner never happened. When my mother called the number Brother Samuel had provided to the community, a woman answered who I assume was Sister Grace. My mother extended the invitation, warm and friendly, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the woman said in a voice that sounded rehearsed that they appreciated the offer, but that Sedona was being disciplined and would not be able to accept social invitations for the foreseeable future. My mother asked what she meant by disciplined, and the line went dead. Sedona stopped coming to school after that. The administration made some calls, and Brother Samuel provided documentation of homeschooling, all legally filed and approved. There was nothing the school could do. I asked the bus driver if she knew what had happened to Sedona, and she said the girl was being educated at home now, that it was the family's right to make that choice. Meanwhile, the church services were changing. My family had attended a few times out of curiosity and community obligation, but what had started as relatively normal Pentecostal services were becoming something else. The worship grew louder, more intense. People began speaking in tongues, falling to the floor, convulsing in what Brother Samuel called the power of the Holy Spirit. He preached about demons, about possession, about the wickedness that lurked in even the most innocent-looking souls. He said that children were particularly vulnerable to demonic influence because their spirits were not yet hardened against evil. My father stopped letting us attend after one service where a woman collapsed and Brother Samuel stood over her, shouting commands at the demon he claimed was inside her. The woman was carried out and Brother Samuel declared that she had been cleansed, that the demon had fled. My father said it looked more like a seizure and that someone should have called an ambulance, but no one did. When we left that night, I looked back at the church and saw Sedona standing in a window, watching us go, her face pressed against the glass. I tried to see her. I rode my bike to the church property one Saturday afternoon, planning to knock on the door of the house where the family lived. a small cottage behind the main church building. But before I could reach the door, Brother Samuel appeared seemingly from nowhere and told me very calmly that I was not welcome on their property, that I was a corrupting influence on his daughter, and that if I returned, he would contact my parents and the authorities. He smiled the entire time he said this, a smile that never reached his eyes, and I rode my bike home as fast as I could, terrified in a way I could not articulate. The services continued to grow stranger. Neighbors who attended reported that the congregation, now numbering around 30 people, had begun staying for hours, sometimes all night, engaged in what Brother Samuel called spiritual warfare. They sang and chanted and prayed in tongues, and sometimes there would be screaming. People in the holler called the police a few times to complain about the noise, but when officers arrived, they were told it was a religious service protected by the First Amendment. And as long as nothing illegal was occurring, there was nothing to be done. One night in late winter, I woke to the sound of my mother crying. I crept downstairs and found my parents at the kitchen table. My mother was on the phone with someone, and my father had his head in his hands. When she hung up, she told my father that she could not stand by and do nothing, that she did not care about minding her own business, that a child was being hurt and someone had to help her. My father agreed, and the next morning my mother called social services. She reported what Sedona had told me about purification, about the scars, about the girl's obvious signs of physical and psychological abuse. She gave them the address of the church, explained about the increasingly extreme services, and asked them to do a welfare check. The caseworker said they would investigate. 2 days later, a social worker and a sheriff's deputy arrived at the church property. They knocked on the door of the cottage. No one answered. They knocked on the church door. No one answered. They walked around the property, peering in windows, and found the buildings empty. Not just empty of people, but empty. The furniture was gone, the personal belongings were gone, even the religious items that had decorated the church were gone. It looked as if no one had lived there in years. The authorities checked with neighbors. Everyone said the same thing. There had been a service the night before. They had heard the singing and the shouting, nothing unusual for that congregation. But no one had seen any vehicles leave. No one had witnessed any kind of exodus. Between the time the services ended late that night and the time the authorities arrived the following afternoon, an entire congregation of more than 30 people had vanished. An investigation was launched. The property was searched thoroughly. They found evidence that people had been living there recently. Food in the garbage, utility bills paid through the previous week. But there was no indication of where they had gone. The vehicles that had been parked behind the church were gone, though no one could say when they had left or which direction they had gone. Authorities discovered that Brother Samuel had done this before. In 3 other small Appalachian towns over the previous decade, he had arrived, established a congregation, drawn people in with his charismatic preaching, and then disappeared overnight, taking his followers with him. In each case, there had been reports of extreme religious practices, allegations of abuse, and investigations that went nowhere because by the time authorities acted, everyone was gone. They never found Sedona. They never found Brother Samuel or Sister Grace. They never found any of the 30-plus people who had been part of that congregation. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. I am 43 years old now, live in Lexington, far from that holler, far from those mountains. I have a career, a family, a normal life. But I still think about Sedona almost every day. I search faces in crowds, in grocery stores, in airports, hoping against reason that I will see those hollow eyes again, that I will know she survived, that she got away from whatever darkness swallowed her that winter night in 1998. But I know the truth, even if I cannot say it out loud to most people. Some people get swallowed up by belief, by men who twist faith into something monstrous, who use God's name to justify cruelty, and the mountains keep their secrets. They hide the places where children are hurt in the name of salvation, where screams are mistaken for prayers, where entire groups of people can vanish and leave barely a trace behind. I do not know what happened to Sedona after they left. I do not know if she is alive. I do not know if Brother Samuel ever faced justice for what he did to her, for what he likely did to others. The case is still technically open, but no new leads have emerged in over 2 decades. The file sits in some cabinet in a county sheriff's office, gathering dust, waiting for evidence that will probably never come. Sometimes I dream about her. In the dream, she is still 16, still wearing those long-sleeved dresses, still flinching at sounds and touch. She tells me that she tried to get out, that she tried to ask for help, but no one came in time. And I wake up with the terrible weight of knowing that is true, that we saw what was happening and we did not act quickly enough, that by the time we tried to help, it was already too late. The mountains kept their secrets. And somewhere in those mountains, or somewhere far away where Brother Samuel took his congregation, Sedona remains lost. A girl whose childhood was stolen by someone who claimed to speak for God, whose scars were called purification, whose suffering was called righteousness. And no one ever saved her. The moment I saw the photographs pinned to that mine wall, I knew we had stumbled into something we were never meant to find. My hands started shaking so badly that I dropped my flashlight, and in the seconds it took to retrieve it from the dusty ground, I considered running. I should have run. God, I wish I had run. My name is irrelevant to this story, but what I do matters. I am an urban explorer, or at least I was. I documented abandoned places, the forgotten corners of Appalachia where industry died and left behind skeletal remains of what used to be. Coal mines, factories, entire towns that people just walked away from when the jobs disappeared. I had a YouTube channel with a decent following, nothing huge, but enough that I could justify the gas money and equipment costs. My friend Talon usually came with me. He handled the camera work while I did the narrating and the actual exploring. It was October of 2019 when we decided to investigate a series of abandoned coal mines outside of a small town in West Virginia. The town itself was barely hanging on, population maybe 300, the kind of place where half the storefronts on Main Street were boarded up, and the people who remained looked at you with a mixture of suspicion and exhaustion. We did not tell anyone what we were doing. You are not technically supposed to enter abandoned mines. They are dangerous, unstable, full of toxic gases and collapse risks. But that danger was part of the appeal for our audience. We had a list of 3 different mine entrances to check out, all within a few miles of each other. The first 2 were disappointing from a content perspective. They had been sealed properly with concrete barriers, and while we could have potentially found a way around them, it would have taken equipment we did not have and more time than we wanted to spend. The third mine was different. The entrance was hidden behind overgrown vegetation, barely visible from the old access road. Someone had put up a chain-link fence at some point, but time and weather had torn sections of it down. There were warning signs, faded and rusted, telling us that entry was forbidden and dangerous. We ignored them. We had ignored dozens of similar signs before. The entrance tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, shored up with old timber supports that creaked ominously as we passed beneath them. Our lights cut through the darkness, illuminating walls of exposed rock and coal seams, railroad tracks that had long since rusted into the floor. The air smelled like earth and decay, and our breath formed clouds in the cold. We walked for maybe 20 minutes, filming as we went, Talon providing commentary about the history of coal mining in the region while I examined the various side tunnels and chambers. Most of them were empty or collapsed, nothing interesting. We were about to turn back, considering the trip a partial failure, when Talon noticed something odd. There was a side shaft that did not appear on any of the mine maps we had researched. The maps were old, admittedly, photocopies of documents from the mining company that had operated the site back in the 1960s and 70s. But this shaft looked different from the others. The entrance had been deliberately sealed with loose rock and timber, not a cave-in but a constructed barrier, as if someone had wanted to hide it. Talon suggested we investigate. I was hesitant. Something about it felt wrong, but I could not articulate why. In the end, curiosity won. We spent about 15 minutes carefully removing enough of the barrier to create an opening we could squeeze through. The shaft beyond was narrower than the main tunnel, more like a natural cave than a man-made excavation. We had to walk single file, and the ceiling was low enough that we had to duck in places. The shaft wound deeper into the mountain, taking turns that seemed random, and I started to worry that we would get lost. I was about to suggest we turn back when the passage opened into a chamber. It was not a natural chamber. Someone had excavated it, expanded it, turned it into a space roughly the size of a large bedroom, and someone had been living there. There was a sleeping bag in one corner, relatively clean, the kind you could buy at any sporting goods store. There were canned goods stacked against one wall, dozens of them, soup and vegetables and beans. There were battery-powered lanterns, a camping stove, bottles of water. It looked like someone had set up a long-term residence underground. But it was the far wall that made my blood turn to ice. The wall was covered with photographs. Not just a few photographs, but dozens, maybe over 100, pinned to the rock with thumbtacks or tape. They were photographs of women, different ages, but all relatively young, all local based on the backgrounds I recognized. Some of the photos looked recent, printed on modern photo paper with the kind of quality you get from a decent digital camera. Others were older, faded, the kind of Polaroids and film prints from the 80s and 90s. Beneath each photograph was a date, written in neat handwriting with a black marker directly on the rock. The dates ranged from 1987 to just a few weeks before we arrived. Talon stopped filming. We just stood there, staring at the wall, trying to process what we were seeing. I recognized one of the women. Not personally, but I had seen her face before. There was a missing person flyer posted at the gas station where we had filled up that morning. A woman named Jennifer or Jessica, I could not remember exactly. She had disappeared 6 months earlier. Her photograph was on that wall, dated appropriately. I started looking at the other faces, trying to see if I recognized anyone else. That was when Talon found the journal. It was sitting on a small folding table near the sleeping bag next to a tin cup and a flashlight. The journal was a simple spiral-bound notebook, the kind you could buy at any dollar store. Talon opened it and we started reading by the light of our headlamps. The entries went back years. The handwriting was consistent throughout, suggesting a single author who signed each entry with the initials DR. The entries were not daily, more sporadic, sometimes weeks or months between them, but the content was stomach-turning. DR wrote about watching these women. He described their routines, where they worked, where they shopped, what time they came home. He wrote about following them, about the thrill of being close to them without their knowledge. Some entries described what he wanted to do to them, fantasies that grew progressively more violent and disturbing as the journal went on. And some entries were different. Some entries were written in past tense, describing things he had already done. They were vague, never explicit, but the implication was clear. These were not fantasies. These were records. Talon found a box tucked under the table. Inside were personal items, jewelry, a hairbrush, a wallet with an ID card belonging to a woman whose photograph was on the wall. There was a collection of small things, the kind of items someone might carry in a purse or wear daily. Trophies. I was going to be sick. I stepped away from the table, trying to breathe, trying to think. We needed to get out. We needed to call the police. This was not abandoned history. This was an active crime scene. Someone was using this place, and based on the fresh food, based on the recent dates, that someone had been here very recently. That was when we heard it. A sound deeper in the mine in one of the passages that branched off from the chamber. It was rhythmic, steady. Footsteps. We did not discuss it. We did not debate what to do. We ran. Talon grabbed the camera and we scrambled back through the narrow passage, not caring about the noise we were making, not caring about anything except getting out. I kept expecting to hear someone behind us, to feel a hand grab my ankle. But the only sounds were our own panicked breathing and the scattering of loose rocks under our feet. We made it back to the main tunnel and ran toward the entrance. I do not know if we were actually being chased or if fear made us imagine it, but we did not stop until we were outside, gasping in the cold October air, hands on our knees, hearts pounding. When we had caught our breath enough to speak, Talon said we needed to go to the police immediately. I agreed. We drove straight to the sheriff's office in the nearest town and told them everything. They were skeptical at first. 2 kids with cameras talking about a chamber full of photographs in an abandoned mine sounds like a horror movie plot, not reality. But we showed them the footage Talon had captured and their expressions changed. They assembled a team and insisted we guide them back to the location. We did not want to go back, but we did not feel like we had a choice. By the time we arrived at the mine with the police, it was getting dark. They brought proper equipment, lights, radios, weapons. We led them through the main tunnel to the sealed shaft. We led them through the narrow passage to the chamber. The chamber was empty. Not empty like no one was there, empty like it had never been there. The sleeping bag was gone, the food was gone, the lanterns and the stove and the table were gone. The box of personal items was gone, and the wall that had been covered with photographs, was bare rock. No photographs, no thumbtacks, no dates written in marker. Nothing. The police searched the entire area. They found no evidence that anyone had been living there. No disturbed dust where items had been, no impressions in the dirt where a sleeping bag had laid, no marks on the rock where tape had been. It was as if we had imagined the entire thing. They asked us if we were sure this was the right chamber. We were sure. They asked us if we had been drinking or using drugs. We had not. They reviewed Talon's footage. The footage showed us walking through the mine, showed us removing the barrier, showed us entering the narrow passage. But the footage of the chamber itself was corrupted, just static and distorted audio. Talon swore it had been fine when he filmed it. The police took our statements and told us they would investigate further, but their expressions said they thought we were wasting their time, that we had either made it up for attention or had gotten confused about what we had seen. We left West Virginia that night and have not been back since. Talon and I stopped doing urban exploration together. The experience broke something between us, some trust or shared understanding that could not be repaired. He moved to Oregon. I quit YouTube entirely. But I know what we saw. I touched that journal. I read those entries. I saw those photographs, those women's faces, those dates. 3 of those women in the photos are still listed as missing. Their cases are still open. And whoever DR is, whatever he did or is still doing, he is out there somewhere in those mountains. The police never found him. They never even confirmed he exists. But I know he does. And I know that he knew we were there, that he was somewhere in those tunnels when we found his chamber, and that he came back and erased every trace before the authorities arrived. The mountains keep their secrets. And sometimes those secrets know how to keep themselves. I found out what really happened to Alara when I was going through my late mother's belongings. There was a letter she never mailed to the police dated 1995, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the summer my best friend vanished. My mother died in the spring of 2023 after a long battle with cancer. As her only child, the responsibility of sorting through her estate fell to me. It was an emotionally exhausting process, going through decades of accumulated memories, deciding what to keep and what to let go. I found the letter in a shoebox at the back of her closet, tucked beneath old photographs and birthday cards. The envelope was addressed to the Asheville Police Department, but had never been sealed, never been stamped, never been sent. The letter was dated August 23, 1995. I was 14 years old that summer. Ilara was my best friend, had been since we were in first grade together. We lived in a small town in the mountains of North Carolina, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and children rode their bikes everywhere without supervision. It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be the kind of childhood people look back on with nostalgia. Ilara disappeared on August 19, 1995. I remember the day perfectly. We had made plans to meet at the public library that afternoon to work on a school project that was not due until September. But we were both the type of students who started early. Ilara never showed up. When she was not home by dinner time, her parents called the police. The investigation concluded that Ilara was a runaway. She had been having arguments with her parents about typical teenage things, curfew and grades, and whether she could get her ears pierced. The police found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no witnesses reporting anything suspicious. She had simply walked out of her house that afternoon and never come back. Her case went cold within months. For 28 years, I believed that narrative. I believed Ilara had run away, that she was out there somewhere living a different life, that maybe she had her reasons for never contacting anyone from her old life. It gave me a strange kind of comfort thinking she was alive somewhere, even if I would never see her again. My mother's letter destroyed that comfort. In the letter, my mother described seeing something the day Ilara disappeared. She had been driving home from the grocery store, taking the route that went past the library where Ilara and I were supposed to meet. She saw Ilara walking along Main Street, heading in the direction of the library, and she saw a man following her. My mother described the man as middle-aged, wearing work clothes, driving a blue pickup truck that was moving slowly along the street, keeping pace with Ilara. My mother wrote that she recognized him as a drifter who had been doing odd jobs around town for the past few weeks, handyman work, painting, minor repairs. She had seen him around but did not know his name. She watched as the truck pulled up beside Ilara, watched as the man leaned out the window and said something to her. My mother wrote that she saw Ilara smile and approach the truck, that it looked consensual, that Ilara climbed into the passenger seat willingly. Because it looked consensual, because Ilara seemed to know the man, or at least was not afraid of him, my mother did not think anything was wrong. She drove on, went home, put away her groceries. When she heard later that evening that Ilara was missing, she felt the first stirring of concern, but she talked herself out of it. She told herself that the police would find Ilara, that the girl had probably just gone somewhere with the man and lost track of time. When the police concluded Ilara was a runaway, my mother convinced herself that what she had seen must have been Ilara leaving town of her own free will. But my mother never fully believed it. The letter made that clear. She wrote about the guilt that had been eating at her for years, the knowledge that she should have reported what she saw, that her silence might have cost Ilara her life. She wrote that she had tried multiple times to write to the police or call them, but fear and shame always stopped her. Fear that she would be blamed for not coming forward sooner. Shame that she had seen something and done nothing. The letter ended with my mother saying she was finally going to send it, that she could not carry the secret anymore. but she never did. She held on to it for 28 years until cancer took her and the secret was passed to me. I did not know what to do with the information at first. Part of me wanted to burn the letter, to let the secret die with my mother, but I kept thinking about Ilara, about her family, about the not knowing that must have consumed them for nearly 3 decades. I owed it to them to at least try to find the truth. I began researching. I started with old newspaper articles from 1995, archived in the local library's digital database. I found articles about Ilara's disappearance, but also articles about other disappearances. Between 1989 and 1997, 6 teenage girls vanished from towns along the same highway corridor that ran through our region. All were between 14 and 16 years old. All disappeared without a trace. And in several of the articles, witnesses mentioned seeing a blue pickup truck in the area around the time of the disappearances. I contacted a retired detective named Thomas Brennan who had worked several of these cases. He was in his 70s now, living in a retirement community in Florida. I told him about my mother's letter, about what she had seen. He was silent for a long time after I finished. Then he told me about a man named RM, a suspect who had been on their radar throughout the 90s. RM was an itinerant carpenter who moved from town to town, picking up odd jobs, staying in cheap motels or camping in his truck. He matched the description my mother had given. He drove a blue pickup, and he was in each of the towns where girls disappeared, working jobs right around the time of the disappearances. But they never had enough evidence to charge him. The case was entirely circumstantial. No bodies were ever recovered. No witnesses saw anything concrete. No physical evidence linked him to any of the girls. He was questioned multiple times, but always had alibis, always had explanations for why he was in those towns. Detective Brennan told me that in 1997, one girl escaped. She was 16, had been missing for 3 days when she was found walking along a highway, traumatized and barely coherent. She described being held in a basement workshop, described being assaulted, described a man who matched RM's description. But her account was inconsistent due to trauma, and defense attorneys argued it would never hold up in court. After that girl escaped and came forward, the disappearances stopped. RM left the region and was never seen again. He died in 2003 in a car accident in Montana. The case died with him. Detective Brennan believed RM was responsible for all 6 disappearances, possibly more. He believed the bodies were buried somewhere in the vast Appalachian wilderness, in places so remote that they might never be found. He thanked me for calling, said that my mother's testimony, even after all these years, confirmed what he had always suspected. I asked him if he knew where RM's workshop had been, the place where the surviving girl had been held. He gave me an address. It was in a town about 30 miles from where I grew up, in an industrial area that had been mostly abandoned even back in the 90s. The building had been demolished in the early 2000s, replaced by a storage facility. I drove there on a cold morning in November. I stood in the parking lot of the storage facility, looking at the anonymous buildings, trying to imagine what had been there before. Trying to imagine Ilara in that place, scared and alone, calling for help that never came. I left flowers at the spot where the detective said the old building had stood. White roses, Ilara's favorite. I said goodbye to my friend 28 years too late. My mother carried that guilt to her grave. And Ilara never got to leave that blue truck, never got to grow up, never got to have the life she should have had. Some monsters hide in plain sight. They do odd jobs, paint houses, fix fences, smile at your parents. They look ordinary, they look safe. And the mountains bury the evidence so deep that even justice cannot dig it up. Ilara's family still lives in our hometown. I have not contacted them. I do not know if telling them what I learned would bring closure or just reopen wounds that have barely healed. I do know if they deserve to know that someone saw their daughter get into that truck, that someone could have said something and did not. I think about my mother's silence often. I do not hate her for it. Fear and guilt are powerful things and humans are fallible. But I think about how different things might have been if she had made that phone call in 1995, if she had trusted her instincts instead of talking herself out of them. And I think about Alara, 14 years old, walking toward the library on a summer afternoon, probably thinking about our project, about what we would do after we finished, about normal teenage things. And then a blue truck pulling up beside her, a man with a kind voice offering her a ride, and her smiling because adults in small towns were supposed to be trustworthy because she had no reason to be afraid. The mountains keep their secrets, and some of those secrets are named Alara. Marisol disappeared when we were 9 years old, so when she knocked on my door at age 32, I thought I was losing my mind. It was a Tuesday evening in March of 2024. I was living in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a small apartment that overlooked the city, far enough from the mountains of my childhood, but close enough that I could still see them on the horizon. I had just gotten home from work, was making dinner when I heard the knock. 3 soft taps, hesitant, almost apologetic. I opened the door and there she stood, Marisol, exactly as I remembered her from 23 years ago. Same height, same build, same round face with the scattering of freckles across her nose. She was wearing the same clothes she had been wearing the day she disappeared. A purple t-shirt with a cartoon character on it, and blue jeans that were slightly too short, white sneakers that were scuffed at the toes. Even her backpack was the same, a pink canvas bag with her initials written in marker on the front. She looked at me and smiled, that same shy smile she always had, and said my name. Just my name, spoken exactly the way she used to say it when we were children playing in her backyard in that little town tucked into the hills of eastern Tennessee. I stood there staring at her, unable to process what I was seeing. My brain was trying to make sense of it, cycling through explanations. This was not Marisol, this was someone who looked like her. A relative maybe, a daughter or a niece who bore a striking resemblance. Or I was hallucinating. Or I had fallen asleep on the couch and this was a dream. But she said my name again and she knew things. She mentioned our 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson. She mentioned the time we built a fort in the woods behind her house and got poison ivy. She mentioned the names of our classmates, kids I had not thought about in decades. And her voice was exactly right, that particular pitch and cadence that I could still hear in my memories if I tried hard enough. I let her in. I do not know why. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that I should call someone, that I should not be alone with whatever this was. But she looked so small and lost, standing in my doorway, and some part of me, the part that was still 9 years old and grieving for my missing friend, needed to believe. She sat on my couch and looked around my apartment with wide eyes, taking in the television, the laptop on my coffee table, the modern furniture. She picked up my phone from where it was charging and turned it over in her hands, confused. She asked what it was. I told her it was a phone. She asked where the cord was, how you dialed it. She did not understand. I asked her where she had been. She said she had just gotten lost for a little while. I asked her how she found me. She said she remembered I lived in Knoxville and asked people until someone helped her find my building. I asked her what year she thought it was. She said it was 2001, that it was August, that school was starting soon and she needed to get home before her mother got worried. It was not 2001. It was 2024. And Marisol had disappeared in August of 2001, just a few days before 4th grade was supposed to start. She had been walking home from my house, a route she had walked hundreds of times just 5 blocks through our quiet neighborhood. She never made it home. The police searched for weeks. They interviewed everyone, checked every house, dragged the nearby creek. They never found a trace of her. I called her mother. I did not know what else to do. I still had the number saved in my phone from years ago, though I had not called it in at least a decade. A woman answered, and when I said I was calling about Marisol, there was a long silence. Then she asked me who I was. I told her. She hung up on me. Marisol was becoming more distressed as the evening wore on. She kept asking about things that did not make sense to her. Why were all the cars outside so different? Why did my TV not have buttons? Where were the commercials for shows she used to watch? I showed her the date on my phone, on my laptop, on the calendar hanging in my kitchen. She looked at them but did not seem to understand. She insisted it was 2001. She insisted she was 9 years old. I looked at her closely. She was 9 years old. I am not speaking metaphorically. She had not aged a day since the morning she disappeared 23 years ago. She was the same height, the same weight. Her teeth still had that small gap in the front. She still had a bruise on her knee from where she had fallen off her bike a few days before she vanished. A detail I remembered distinctly because I had been there when it happened. I called the police. They sent 2 officers who clearly thought they were responding to a mental health crisis or a prank. But when they saw Marisol, when they heard her speak, their expressions changed. They called for backup. They called for a supervisor. Within an hour, my apartment was full of law enforcement, social workers, a detective who specialized in missing persons cases. They took Marisol to the hospital. They wanted to examine her, to document everything, to try to understand what they were dealing with. I went with her because she was scared and kept asking for me. The medical examination confirmed what I already knew. She was physically 9 years old, her dental development, her bone structure, her height and weight, all consistent with a child of that age. They took DNA samples and compared them to the samples her family had provided back in 2001. It was a match. This was Marisol. But none of it made sense. People do not stop aging. People do not disappear for 23 years and return unchanged. The doctors had no explanation. The police had no explanation. They asked Marisol questions, gentle questions designed not to frighten her, about where she had been. She kept giving the same confused answers. She said she had gotten lost in the woods behind the school. She said there was a man there who told her he would help her find her way home. She said he took her to a place where time did not move right, where it was always the same day, where other children were there too. She gave names of the other children. The detective wrote them down, and I watched his face go pale as he recognized them. They were names from missing persons cases. Children who had vanished from towns across Tennessee and Kentucky between 1998 and 2005. 7 names. 7 children who had never been found. Marisol said the man kept them in a place that was not quite real, that when you were there you did not get hungry or tired or older. She said he told them stories and made them play games. She said he was not mean, but he would not let them leave. She said she finally found a door, that the door was not always there, but sometimes it appeared, and she went through it and found herself back in the woods, and she walked until she found a road and then a town. And then someone helped her get to Knoxville. The police searched the woods behind our old school. They searched for days with dogs and ground-penetrating radar and every resource they could bring to bear. They found nothing. No structure, no cellar, no cave, nothing that could have hidden a man and 7 children for years or decades. I spent 3 days with Marisol at the hospital. She became increasingly agitated, increasingly afraid. She said he was going to know, she told, that he was going to come for her. She said she needed to go back. that if she did not go back, he would be angry. The doctors thought she was experiencing trauma, that she was remembering abuse and her mind was protecting her by creating a fantasy. But I saw the terror in her eyes, and it was real. On the fourth day, Marisol asked me to take her back to the woods. She said she needed to show me where the door was, that maybe if I could see it, I could help the other children. Against every piece of advice I was given, I agreed. We drove to our old hometown, to the school we had attended. The woods behind it were still there, though smaller than I remembered, encroached upon by new development. We walked into the trees. Marisol led the way, moving with certainty despite not having been there in what for everyone else had been 23 years. We walked for maybe 10 minutes before she stopped in a small clearing. She pointed to a spot between two large oak trees and said the door was there. I looked. I saw nothing but air and undergrowth. She insisted it was there, that she could see it, that it was opening. She turned to look at me, and there were tears running down her face. She said I had to tell people she was sorry. She said she had to go back, that if she did not, he would come out and take someone else. She said the other children were still there and someone needed to stay with them, that they were scared. I tried to grab her hand. I tried to hold on to her, to stop her from going anywhere. But she pulled away and walked forward toward the spot where she said the door was, and I watched as she disappeared. Not walked out of sight, not slipped behind a tree. She took 3 steps forward, and on the 3rd step she was simply gone, as if she had walked through a curtain that I could not see. I stood there for hours, calling her name, searching the area, trying to find any rational explanation for what I had just witnessed. Eventually, I called the police and told them what had happened. They searched the woods again. They found nothing. They questioned me repeatedly, clearly suspecting that I had done something to Marisol, that I was responsible for her disappearance. But forensics could not find evidence of any crime. The hospital had extensive documentation of her existence, photographs, DNA evidence, testimony from dozens of witnesses. She had been real. And now she was gone again. The case remains open. The authorities do not know how to classify it. Every expert says what I saw is impossible, that there must be a rational explanation, that perhaps I suffered some kind of dissociative episode or hallucination. But the evidence says otherwise. Marisol was real, she was documented, and then she vanished in front of me. I am 43 years old now, and I still go back to those woods sometimes. I stand in that clearing between the oak trees and I look for a door I cannot see. And I think about the other children, the 7 names Marisol gave us, children who are still listed as missing, who are presumably still wherever she was, still 9 or 10 or 12 years old, suspended in a place where time does not work the way it should, kept by someone or something that the rest of us cannot perceive. And I think about Marisol, who came back just long enough to tell us the truth, and who chose to go back rather than let that thing come into our world. The mountains swallowed her twice, and the second time, I watched it happen, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I worked as a state trooper in West Virginia for 22 years, and I have seen some terrible things. Car accidents that turned highways into nightmares, domestic violence calls that ended in bloodshed, overdoses that claimed people who were somebody's child or parent or friend. But nothing prepared me for what we found at Jason's property in the winter of 2017. Nothing in my training, nothing in my experience, nothing in my worst nightmares came close to the reality of that place. I am retired now, living in Florida where the sun is warm and the landscape is flat, and there are no mountains to hide secrets. But I still wake up some nights drenched in sweat, still seeing that cellar, still smelling that smell. My wife says I should talk to someone, get therapy, process what I saw. But how do you process something like that? How do you explain to a therapist that you have looked into the face of pure evil and watched it smile at you? Jason was nobody. That is what made it so disturbing. He was not a criminal mastermind or some cunning psychopath who played games with investigators. He was just a man, unremarkable in every way, living alone on a piece of property so remote that his nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired, soft-spoken when he spoke at all. People in the area knew him by sight, but not by friendship. He kept to himself, made rare trips into town for supplies, paid his property taxes on time. He was invisible, which was exactly what he wanted to be. The call came in on a Tuesday night in January, anonymous tip, which is never a good sign. The caller reported a bad smell coming from Jason's property and claimed to have heard screaming at night. The dispatcher tried to get more information, but the caller hung up. We ran the address and found nothing concerning in the records. No warrants, no complaints, no criminal history. Just an old man living alone in the mountains. My partner and I drove out there the next morning. The property was at the end of a long dirt road that wound through dense forest. The kind of place where your GPS signal cuts out and you start to question whether you're still on an actual road. The house was small, 1 story. Vinyl siding that had seen better days. There was a rusted pickup truck in the driveway and smoke coming from the chimney. Jason answered our knock within seconds, as if he had been waiting just inside the door. He was polite, called us officers, asked how he could help. My partner explained about the complaint, the smell, the reports of screaming. Jason smiled, a thin smile that did not reach his eyes, and said there must be some mistake. He lived alone, he said. There was no screaming. As for the smell, well, he had some dead livestock buried on his property. Sometimes in the winter when the ground shifted, the smell came back up. It happened. He was calm, reasonable. Everything you would expect from an innocent man dealing with a false complaint. But something felt wrong. My partner felt it too. We asked if we could take a look around the property just to confirm everything was fine and close out the complaint. Jason's smile tightened. He said he would prefer if we did not, that he valued his privacy, that we would need a warrant. That was his mistake. Innocent people usually let you look. They want to prove there is nothing wrong, want to make the problem go away. People who demand warrants usually have something to hide. My partner stepped closer to the door, and that is when we smelled it. Not buried livestock. Decomposition. Human decomposition. Once you smell it, you never forget it. It is distinct, unmistakable, the smell of death. We had probable cause. My partner called for backup while I kept Jason at the door. He did not try to run, did not argue, just stood there with that thin smile and watched us. When backup arrived, we began to search the property. The house itself was unremarkable. Clean, sparsely furnished, nothing unusual. But in the bedroom there was a rug that looked out of place, too new compared to everything else. We moved it and found a trapdoor cut into the floor, secured with a heavy padlock. Jason still said nothing, just watched us with those dead eyes. We cut the lock. The smell that came up when we opened that door was overpowering. 2 of the officers had to step outside. I have smelled death before, but this was different. This was concentrated horror, the accumulated stench of years. The cellar was not a basement. It was a chamber that Jason had excavated himself, expanded beyond the original foundation of the house. It was divided into sections, crude cells made from chain-link fencing and 2x4s. There were chains bolted to the walls. There was dried blood on the concrete floor, so much of it that in some places it was layered, one horror on top of another. And there were remains, 4 bodies in various states of decomposition, some reduced to skeletal remains, others more recent. We later identified them as people who had been reported missing from neighboring counties over the span of 8 years. a truck driver who had vanished while passing through on Route 19, a hitchhiker last seen outside of Charleston, a woman who had left a bar in Beckley and never made it home, a teenager who ran away from a group home and was presumed to have left the state. The forensics team found evidence of more, hair samples that did not match the identified victims. DNA from at least 9 to 12 different individuals based on preliminary testing. Blood evidence that suggested violence, repeated violence, over an extended period. Jason had kept people alive down there. He had kept them for weeks, sometimes months before killing them. We arrested him on the spot. During transport, he said nothing. During booking, he said nothing. It was not until the interrogation that he finally spoke, and what he said was worse than if he had stayed silent. He described his victims like someone discussing a hobby. He talked about collecting them, about the process of choosing them. He preferred people who would not be missed, drifters and addicts and runaways. People whose disappearance would be noted but not aggressively investigated. He talked about how long he could keep them, about what he did to them, about how their fear sustained him. My captain had to leave the room. 2 of the detectives who were observing through the glass had to step out, but I stayed. Someone had to hear it, had to document it, had to make sure that every word was recorded so that there would be no possibility of him escaping justice on a technicality. At one point, I asked him where the others were, the victims whose DNA we had found but whose bodies were not in the cellar. He smiled then, really smiled for the first time. He said we would never find them. He said the mountains around his property were vast, full of places where bodies could be hidden, where they would decompose and be scattered by animals and weather until there was nothing left to find. He said these mountains were good at keeping secrets. He said he just helped them. The trial was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of kidnapping and assault. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. In West Virginia, we do not have the death penalty. Some people thought that was a mercy he did not deserve. I understood their anger. Jason died in prison in 2021. Heart attack. Natural causes as much as anything about him could be called natural. He was 66 years old. He never showed remorse. He never provided information about the other victims. He took those secrets to his grave. I retired not long after the trial. I told myself it was because I had put in my 22 years, earned my pension, wanted to spend time with my grandchildren. But the truth was, I could not do the job anymore. I could not drive through those mountains without wondering what was hidden in the trees, could not respond to missing person reports without thinking about Jason's cellar, could not look at people without wondering what darkness might be hiding behind their eyes. The families of the 4 identified victims got some measure of closure. They were able to bury their loved ones, to have funerals, to begin the process of grieving properly. But the other families, the ones whose DNA was found in that cellar but whose bodies were never recovered, they got nothing. They still do not know what happened to their missing children, their missing siblings, their missing parents. They live in the terrible limbo of not knowing, of hoping against hope that maybe the forensics were wrong, that maybe their loved one is still alive somewhere. I think about them often. I think about the 9 to 12 people who walked into that house and never walked out, whose remains are scattered somewhere in the endless wilderness of Backbone Ridge. I think about how many times I drove past Jason's property over the years. How many times I might have been minutes away from saving someone if only I had known to look. But mostly I think about what Jason said, about the mountains keeping secrets. He was right. These ancient mountains have witnessed centuries of human darkness. They have hidden bodies and crimes and horrors that will never be discovered. They swallow up evidence and witnesses and truth, and they give nothing back. Jason was not the first monster to use these mountains as his hunting ground. and he will not be the last. The isolation that makes Appalachia beautiful also makes it dangerous. The same forests that offer peace and solitude also offer concealment and opportunity for those who mean harm. I live in Florida now, where everything is open and flat and exposed. There are no mountains here to hide secrets. But I still dream about West Virginia, about that cellar, about Jason's smile. And I still wonder every single day how many more cellars are hidden in those hills. How many more monsters are living invisible lives waiting for the next person who will not be missed. The mountains keep their secrets, and some secrets should never have been kept. We found Dakota's camcorder 3 years after he disappeared, sitting on a rock at the exact trailhead where he started his hike. The battery was dead, but the footage was intact. I wish we had never watched it. My name is unimportant, but my position is. I am a park ranger in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, have been for 15 years. I have seen people get lost, seen them get injured, seen them make stupid decisions that cost them their lives. But I have never seen anything like what happened to Dakota, and I hope I never see anything like it again. Dakota went missing in July of 2018. He was 28 years old, an experienced solo hiker who had been documenting his journey through the Appalachian Trail on his YouTube channel. He was not reckless, not the type to go off trail without good reason or ignore weather warnings. He had the right gear, the right experience, and most importantly, he had told people exactly where he was going and when he expected to be back. When he did not check in with his family after his planned 5-day hike, they reported him missing immediately. We launched a massive search operation, search and rescue teams, tracking dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging, volunteers from local hiking clubs. We searched for 2 weeks, covering over 50 square miles of wilderness. We found nothing, no campsite, no discarded gear, no sign that he had ever been on that trail. It was as if he had simply evaporated. The case went cold. Dakota was classified as missing, presumed dead, though we never found a body. His family held a memorial service. His YouTube channel remained frozen in time, his last video showing him excited about the upcoming hike, talking about the route he planned to take, the sights he hoped to see. Then in June of 2021, nearly 3 years to the day after Dakota disappeared, a day hiker found the camcorder. It was sitting on a flat rock right at the trailhead where Dakota had begun his journey, positioned as if someone had deliberately placed it there. The hiker, thinking someone had accidentally left it, turned it into the ranger station. When we checked the camera's information and saw Dakota's name on the memory card, we knew we had found something significant. I was part of the team that reviewed the footage. We gathered in a conference room, myself and 3 other rangers, along with a detective from the local sheriff's office who had worked Dakota's case. We expected to find clues, maybe see what route Dakota had actually taken, possibly identify the location where something had gone wrong. The first 90% of the footage was exactly what you would expect. Beautiful scenery, Dakota narrating as he hiked, setting up camp, cooking meals, talking to the camera about his experiences. He seemed happy, relaxed, in his element. The footage spanned 6 days, which was already longer than his planned 5-day hike, but not unusual for someone who might have decided to extend their trip. On day 4, things started to change. Dakota mentioned feeling like he was being followed. He kept looking behind him, scanning the tree line. He tried to laugh it off, made jokes about being paranoid, but you could see the tension in his shoulders, hear the unease in his voice. Day 5, the feeling intensified. He filmed what he thought was someone in the trees about 50 yards off the trail. The footage showed a dark shape, indistinct. Could have been a person or could have been shadows and branches creating an illusion. Dakota called out, asking if someone was there, if they needed help. No response. The shape moved or seemed to move, disappearing deeper into the forest. That night, Dakota set up camp but did not build a fire. He whispered to the camera that he had been hearing footsteps circling his tent for the past hour. Slow and deliberate, but every time he looked outside with his flashlight, there was nothing there. You could hear it in the recording, the sound of something moving through the underbrush, the crack of twigs, the rustle of leaves. Then silence. Then the sounds would start again from a different direction. Day 6 was the final day of footage. Dakota looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice hoarse. He told the camera he was leaving the trail, going to hike straight out to the nearest road, that something was wrong and he needed to get to safety. He did not pack up his tent properly, did not organize his gear the way an experienced hiker would. He just grabbed his essentials and started moving. The final footage was taken while Dakota was walking quickly, almost jogging, breathing hard. The camera was shaky, showing glimpses of trees and trail and sky. Dakota was talking more to himself than to the camera, saying he needed to get out, that it had been following him all night, that it was getting closer. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "If something happens to me, tell my family," and stopped mid-sentence. The camera swung around, showing a blur of forest. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, you could see something. It was unclear if it was a person or an animal or something else entirely. The image was too blurred, too brief. But it was big and it was moving fast, rushing toward the camera. Dakota screamed. The camera fell, hitting the ground, lens up, showing only leaves and a patch of sky. The audio continued. You could hear sounds of struggle, heavy breathing that was not Dakota's, a dragging sound. Then Dakota's voice, distant now, calling for help. Then nothing but ambient forest sounds for several seconds. Then something else. Breathing. Close to the camera, heavy and rhythmic. Whatever it was standing over the camera, looking down at it. The breathing continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 30 seconds. Then footsteps moving away. The footage continued for another 20 minutes, showing nothing but the ground and leaves, the audio capturing only wind and birds and the normal sounds of the forest. Then the battery died and the recording ended. We were silent after watching it. The detective was the first to speak, asking to watch it again. Specifically the part where the thing rushed at Dakota. We must have watched that 2-second clip 50 times, trying to enhance it, trying to see what it was. But the motion blur and low light made it impossible to identify. It was large, that much was clear. And it moved faster than any human should have been able to move through that terrain. We immediately organized a recovery mission. The footage had metadata, GPS coordinates embedded in the files that showed exactly where each clip was recorded. We identified the location where the camera had fallen, where the final moments had been captured. A team went out that same day. The location was 4.7 miles from the trailhead where the camcorder had been found. The terrain was difficult, steep and heavily forested. When the team reached the coordinates, they found evidence of what had happened. Dakota's jacket, torn and bloodstained, was caught on a bush about 20 feet from where the camera had supposedly been. There were signs of a struggle, disturbed earth, broken branches. There was blood, enough that forensics confirmed it was human and later matched it to Dakota through DNA. But there was no body, no other gear, no camera, despite the coordinates indicating it should have been right there. We searched the entire area, expanding in wider and wider circles, but found nothing else. It was as if Dakota had been there. Something had happened to him, and then he had been removed from that location. The case was officially ruled a homicide by unknown assailant. Some investigators believed it was an animal attack, possibly a bear, despite the fact that the behavior did not match typical bear attacks. Others were not convinced, pointing to the deliberate way the camera had been returned to the trailhead, something no animal would do. The camcorder appearing at the trailhead was the detail that haunted us most. The footage ended 4.7 miles away. Someone or something brought that camera back. They carried it through rough terrain, avoided being seen by any hikers or rangers, and placed it on a rock where it would be found. They did this 3 years after Dakota disappeared. Why? To what purpose? If it was a person who had killed Dakota, why provide evidence? If it was an animal, how did the camera get moved? And why wait 3 years? I have watched that footage more times than I should have. I have spent hours staring at that blurred image, trying to see what came out of those trees. I have listened to the breathing, trying to determine if it was human or animal or something I cannot categorize. Every time I patrol that section of the park now, I think about Dakota. I think about him realizing something was wrong, trying to get to safety and not making it. I think about those final moments, the fear he must have felt, and I think about the thing that took him. Because something did take him, something that knew enough to bring that camera back, that understood on some level that leaving it at the trailhead would ensure it was found. That level of calculation, that awareness is what terrifies me. We have increased patrols in that area. We warn hikers to stay alert, to hike in groups, to report anything unusual. But we cannot close the trails. We cannot evacuate the park based on one incident, no matter how disturbing. People have the right to enjoy these mountains, but I know what is out there. I have seen the footage. I have heard the breathing. And I know that whatever took Dakota is still in those mountains somewhere, moving through the trees, watching the trails, waiting. Dakota's family deserves answers. They deserve closure. But I cannot give them that. All I can give them is the truth as I know it. Their son went into the mountains and encountered something that should not exist, or at least should not be possible. And that something took him, and we will probably never find what is left of him. The mountains keep their secrets, but this time, one of those secrets knew how to give us just enough information to ensure we would never stop looking, never stop wondering, never stop being afraid. That is what haunts me most, the possibility that whatever took Dakota wanted us to know, wanted us to see, wanted us to understand that we are not as safe in these mountains as we think we are, and it is still out there. My name is not important, but my sister was Sienna. And when I finally found her in those mountains, she looked at me like I was a stranger and told me I had to leave before the shepherd knew I was there. I had been searching for Sienna for 4 years. 4 years of dead ends and false leads, of private investigators who took my money and delivered nothing, of police who told me my sister was an adult who had made her choice to join a religious community and cut ties with her family. 4 years of not knowing if she was alive or dead, safe or suffering. Sienna disappeared in the spring of 2018. She was 26 years old, working as a nurse in Lexington, Kentucky, living what seemed like a normal life. Then she met them, the congregation. She never told me much about them before she left, just that she had been attending services, that they had shown her a path to spiritual fulfillment, that they understood her in a way no one else ever had. I should have paid more attention. I should have asked more questions. But Sienna had always been searching for something, bouncing between different churches and meditation groups and self-help seminars, looking for meaning or purpose or peace. I thought this was just another phase. I thought she would tire of it like she had tired of everything else. Then one day she called me and said she was moving to a community in the mountains, that the congregation had a compound where members lived together in fellowship, that she had never felt so certain about anything in her life. I asked where. She was vague, somewhere in eastern Kentucky, off the grid, away from the corruption of modern society. I asked if I could visit. She said maybe someday, but first she needed to complete her spiritual preparation. That was the last time I spoke to her. Her phone was disconnected a week later. Her apartment was cleared out. Her nursing license lapsed. She vanished into those mountains as completely as if she had never existed. I tried to find her. I filed missing person reports, but the police said she had left voluntarily, had resigned from her job, had closed her bank accounts and transferred the money. There was no evidence of foul play. She had made her choice. I hired private investigators, but without a specific location, there was little they could do. Eastern Kentucky is vast and rural, full of small communities and isolated properties. A religious group could hide there easily if they wanted to remain hidden. Then in July of 2022, I received a message. It came through Facebook from an account with no profile picture and a fake-sounding name. The message was brief. Your sister needs help. Come to Hollow Creek. Come alone. Attached was an address, or at least coordinates, somewhere in the mountains near the Virginia border. The sender identified themselves only as Raylan. When I tried to respond, the account had been deleted. I should have gone to the police. I should have brought someone with me. But I was afraid that if I did, Sienna would disappear again, that the congregation would scatter and I would never find her. So I did what the message said. I went alone. The drive took 6 hours, the last 2 on increasingly rough roads that wound through dense forest. The coordinates led me to a dirt track barely wide enough for my car, marked with a hand-painted sign that said, "Private Property." I parked and walked. The compound was about half a mile down the track. It was bigger than I expected, a collection of small cabins arranged in a rough circle around a central meeting hall. The buildings were primitive but well-maintained. There was a vegetable garden, clotheslines hung with simple garments, a barn with chickens scratching in the dirt. It looked almost idyllic, like some kind of historical recreation village. But the people did not look idyllic. There were maybe 40 of them, ranging from children to elderly. They all wore similar clothing, simple tunics and pants in muted colors. They moved slowly, methodically, going about various tasks with what seemed like rehearsed precision. Everyone was thin, gaunt even, with the kind of hollowed look that comes from chronic malnutrition. A woman approached me. She was in her 50s, gray-haired, smiling with an expression that did not reach her eyes. She asked if I was lost. I said I was looking for my sister, Sienna. The woman's smile never wavered. She said there was no one here by that name. I said I knew she was lying. Then I saw her. Sienna was carrying water from a well, 2 buckets balanced on a yoke across her shoulders. She looked terrible. She had lost at least 30 pounds, her face drawn and aged beyond her 30 years. Her hair, which she had always kept short and styled, was long and pulled back in a braid. She was wearing the same plain clothing as everyone else. I called her name. She looked up, and for a moment I saw recognition in her eyes. Then fear. She set down the buckets and walked toward me quickly, glancing nervously toward the meeting hall. When she reached me, she did not hug me, did not smile. She said I should not have come, that I needed to leave. I told her I came to bring her home. She said this was her home, that she was happy, that she was free. But her eyes were saying something different. Her eyes were begging for help while her mouth spoke words that sounded rehearsed, programmed. That was when I met him, the shepherd. He emerged from the meeting hall, a tall man in his 50s with the kind of charisma that fills a space before he even speaks. He walked toward us with a smile, welcoming, introducing himself, asking my name. He had a deep voice that was pleasant to listen to, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He said Sienna had spoken of me often, that family was important, that I was welcome to visit any time. But even as he spoke, I noticed the way everyone had stopped what they were doing and was watching us. I noticed the way Sienna kept glancing at him, waiting for permission to speak. I noticed the bruises on her arms partially hidden by her sleeves. I said I wanted to talk to Sienna alone. The shepherd said, of course, that they valued free will above all else, but he did not move away. Sienna and I walked to the edge of the compound, and even then I could feel eyes on us. I begged her to leave. I told her I had a car, that we could go right now, that I would help her rebuild her life. She said she could not, that she had debts to the congregation, that leaving would be abandoning her spiritual family. I asked what debts. She would not answer. Then someone approached us, a young man, maybe 25, thin like everyone else, but with a desperate energy about him. He introduced himself as Raylan. He was the one who had sent the message. He spoke quickly, quietly, glancing over his shoulder constantly. He told me the truth about the congregation. The shepherd controlled every aspect of their lives. When they slept, what they ate, who they could speak to. Marriages were arranged. Children were taken from their parents to be raised communally. Anyone who questioned the shepherd was subjected to correction, which Raylan described as isolation, forced fasting, and something he called spiritual cleansing that sounded like physical and psychological torture. Several members had died over the years. The shepherd called it being called home by God. No doctors, no hospitals, only prayer and faith healing. The bodies were buried somewhere on the property in unmarked graves. No authorities were ever notified. Raylan wanted out. He wanted to help others escape. But the congregation monitored everything, and anyone who tried to leave was brought back and corrected. He said Sienna had tried to leave once, 6 months ago. They caught her at the property line. He would not tell me what they did to her, but after that she stopped talking about leaving. That evening I was invited to attend a service in the meeting hall. I went because I wanted to see more, to understand what I was dealing with. What I witnessed was disturbing beyond description. Hours of chanting, sleep deprivation tactics, the shepherd speaking in what he claimed was divine tongue but sounded like gibberish. People swayed and cried and fell to their knees. The atmosphere was oppressive, suffocating. Sienna was singled out that night. The shepherd called her forward, said she was harboring the sin of pride, that contact with the outside world had infected her spirit. He declared she would undergo a cleansing ceremony, 7 days of isolation and fasting to purge the demon of family attachment. I wanted to grab her and run, but I was one person against 40 in an isolated compound miles from help, surrounded by people who believed the shepherd spoke for God. I would not get her out that way. I left that night, drove until I had cell service and called the FBI. I gave them the coordinates, described what I had seen, told them about the deaths Raylan had mentioned. They took my statement seriously. Within 3 days, they had organized a raid. I went back with them, rode in one of the vehicles as federal agents and local police descended on Hollow Creek. The congregation did not resist violently, but they did resist. They believed the authorities were demons, that this was a test of their faith. They had to be physically removed, some of them screaming that they were being persecuted for their beliefs. Sienna was one of them. She fought the agents trying to help her, screaming that I had betrayed her, that I had condemned her soul. It was the worst moment of my life. The shepherd escaped. In the chaos of the raid, he slipped into the forest and vanished. They searched for weeks but never found him. They discovered he had warrants in 3 different states under different names, a pattern of establishing congregations, taking control of vulnerable people and disappearing when authorities got close. They found the graves Raylan had mentioned, 2 bodies, both showing signs of malnutrition and untreated illness. Members admitted there were others but could not or would not say where they were buried. 12 members, including Sienna and Raylan, were removed from the compound and taken to facilities where they could receive medical care and deprogramming. Sienna initially refused all help, insisting she wanted to go back. It took 2 years of therapy before she began to accept what had happened to her, before she could talk about the abuse without defending it. She lives with me now. She is getting better, slowly. She has gained back the weight, returned to nursing school, started to rebuild her life, but she still has nightmares. She still wakes up some nights convinced the shepherd is calling her back, that she needs to return to Hollow Creek or face divine punishment. Raylan moved out west, changed his name, tries not to think about those years. The compound was seized and demolished, the remaining members scattered, but the shepherd was never found. The FBI suspended their search last year, shifting resources to active cases. And I know he is out there somewhere in those mountains, and I know he is probably not alone. Hollow Creek was not his first congregation. The evidence suggested he had been doing this for at least 15 years, moving from place to place, gathering followers, disappearing before he could be caught. And unless someone stops him, it will not be his last. Because the mountains hide men like him. And people like Sienna walk right into them, believing they have found salvation when really they have found something much worse. The mountains do not judge, they do not intervene, they just hide the darkness and keep the secrets until someone is brave enough or desperate enough to go looking. I found my sister, but there are others still out there, still under the shepherd's control, still believing his lies, still suffering in compounds hidden in these endless hills. And I do not know how to save them.